April 2nd, 1865. Richmond is burning. The Confederate capital, once the beating heart of the rebellion, now chokes on its own smoke as warehouses explode and government buildings collapse into ash. Through streets lit by orange flame and filled with the screams of looters, a convoy of wagons rolls south under armed guard. Inside wooden crates covered with canvas tarps lies what remains of the Confederate treasury. Millions in gold coins, silver bars, and jewelry seized from Southern banks. It is the last wealth of a dying nation, and it will vanish into the Georgia wilderness within days, never to be fully recovered. For over a century, treasure hunters have searched swamps, rivers, and forgotten railroad depots looking for this fortune. But the real story isn't about what was lost. It's about who found it and what they did to keep that secret buried. 23 years later, in the marble and mahogany world of New York's financial district, a prominent banker named Mortimer Ashford collapses during a private dinner at Delmonico's restaurant. The official cause? Heart failure. But when his estate is settled, his executors discover something that shouldn't exist. A sealed letter, written in Ashford's own hand, addressed to no one. Inside, a confession. Ashford admits his family's fortune was not built on railroad investments or stock speculation as society believed, but on gold that came north after the war. Confederate gold. The letter includes names: politicians, railway magnates, Southern officers, all dead by the time it surfaces. And it includes coordinates. GPS didn't exist in 1888, but Ashford had marked locations using surveyor's notes and landmarks, pointing to places in Georgia where portions of the treasure were allegedly reburied after being moved from its original hiding spots. The letter ignites a quiet firestorm among New York's elite. Within months, 3 men connected to Ashford's estate die under suspicious circumstances. A lawyer drowns in the Hudson. A bank clerk falls from a 4th-story window. A former Confederate courier living in obscurity in Brooklyn is found dead in his apartment, his rooms ransacked. No arrests are made. The deaths are ruled accidental or attributed to the hazards of urban life in the Gilded Age. But a young detective in the New York Police Department, a man named Thomas Byrnes, real historical figure, one of the era's most famous investigators, begins to see a pattern. He obtains a copy of Ashford's letter through unofficial channels and starts tracing the names, the roots, the money. What he uncovers is a conspiracy that reaches from the ashes of the Confederacy to the boardrooms of America's most powerful corporations. This is not a story about lost treasure. It is a story about murder, power, and the lengths to which men will go to protect secrets that could destroy them. It is about how the Civil War's legacy was not only fought on battlefields, but in bank vaults and back rooms, where the spoils of a fallen nation were quietly laundered into the fortunes of the Gilded Age. And it is about the Confederate gold that never really vanished. It simply changed hands, transformed from rebel currency into American wealth, carried forward by men who understood that the war's greatest prize was not victory, but survival. What happened to the Confederate treasury? Who took it? And why, decades later, were people still being killed to keep that secret? The answers lie buried not in Georgia mud, but in the hidden histories of America's wealthiest families. Families whose names still echo in the halls of power today. What you're about to see is a dramatic investigation into a true historical mystery, combining documented facts with speculative narrative. The Confederate gold vanished. The question is, where did it go? And who profited? To understand how millions in gold could disappear and reshape American power, we must first return to the spring of 1865, when the Confederacy entered its final, desperate hours. For 4 years, the South had sustained a war that consumed nearly everything: men, resources, hope. By early April, General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was collapsing under relentless Union pressure. Richmond, the Confederate capital, had become a trap. President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet knew that if they remained, they would be captured within days. And so, on the night of April 2nd, as explosions rocked the city and fires spread through the tobacco warehouses along the James River, the Confederate government made its last official act. It evacuated the Treasury. What rolled out of Richmond that night was not just the remnants of a government in exile. It was approximately $1.5 million in gold and silver, the equivalent of roughly $40 million today. This fortune had been consolidated from banks across the South, contributions from wealthy planters, seized Union payrolls, and even melted down church bells. It represented everything the Confederacy had left. And within 2 weeks, most of it would be gone. The convoy moved south under the command of Confederate Navy Captain William H. Parker and a contingent of young midshipmen from the Confederate Naval Academy. They traveled by train when possible, by wagon when the rails were destroyed, always just ahead of Union cavalry. The Treasury passed through Danville, Virginia, then into North Carolina, where Jefferson Davis briefly attempted to continue governing from railway cars and temporary headquarters. By the time Lee surrendered at Appomattox on April 9th, the Treasury train had reached Greensboro. Davis refused to surrender. He believed the war could continue west of the Mississippi, that Southern forces under General Kirby Smith might still fight on. The gold, he insisted, would fund this continued resistance. But as Davis fled deeper into Georgia, his escort dwindled. Cabinet members abandoned him, troops deserted, and the Treasury, once guarded by hundreds, was now protected by fewer than a dozen men, rolling through a countryside where Confederate authority had ceased to exist, and every man with a gun was a potential thief. On May 4, 1865, near Washington, Georgia, the Treasury was divided. Some of the silver was paid out to remnants of Confederate troops as a final gesture, back wages for soldiers who had fought without pay for months. But the gold, the bulk of the fortune, was handled differently. According to official records, much of it was placed in the care of Confederate officers, who were tasked with delivering it to specific locations for safekeeping. Captain Micaiah Clark, acting treasurer of the Confederacy, later testified that he personally supervised the distribution. Some went to former Confederate Secretary of War John C. Breckinridge, who allegedly carried it toward Florida before escaping to Cuba. Other portions were entrusted to officers whose names appeared in fragmented records, men like Colonel Charles Thorburn and Captain Watson Van Benthusen. Within days, Jefferson Davis was captured by Union cavalry near Irwinville, Georgia. He had no gold with him. The Union government interrogated Davis and his associates extensively, desperate to recover the treasury. They found almost nothing. Small amounts were recovered here and there, a few $1,000s buried in a Georgia farmer's field, some silver coins in an abandoned wagon. But the vast majority was gone, evaporated into the chaos of the Confederacy's final days. The official story, the one that appeared in Northern newspapers and government reports, was simple. The Confederate gold had been stolen by Davis's escort, scattered among desperate soldiers, or buried in panic and never recovered. For years, this explanation satisfied most people. But in the decades that followed, strange patterns emerged. Former Confederate officers who had been nearly destitute at war's end began appearing in northern cities with unexplained wealth. Some became investors in railways being built across the South during Reconstruction. Others appeared as silent partners in banking ventures, particularly in New York and Philadelphia, where Southern capital was quietly welcomed despite the recent war. Men who should have been broken by defeat were instead dining in Manhattan's finest restaurants, joining exclusive clubs, marrying their daughters into old Northern money. Where had this wealth come from? In the messy, opportunistic years of Reconstruction, few asked too loudly. The North was busy rebuilding the South and profiting enormously from it. If some former Confederates had money to invest, well, that was just good business. But some people kept records. They noticed names. They tracked investments and traced family connections. And in 1888, when Mortimer Ashford died and his letter surfaced, those fragmented suspicions suddenly had a shape. Ashford's confession didn't just implicate himself, it named a network, a conspiracy that had moved Confederate gold north, laundered it through legitimate businesses, and used it to build fortunes that would dominate American finance for generations. The letter described meetings in hotel rooms, agreements made in the confusion of 1865, and payments distributed over years to ensure silence. It was a ghost map of money that had supposedly vanished, now revealed to have traveled very specific routes into very specific hands. And standing between that revelation and the public were men who had everything to lose, men who would kill to protect what their fathers and grandfathers had stolen from a fallen nation. Before we follow Detective Byrnes into the shadows of this conspiracy, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. This story spans from the battlefields of Virginia to the boardrooms of Manhattan, and we want to know where it's reaching you today. The afternoon of April 2nd, 1865, began with silence in the Confederate War Department. President Jefferson Davis sat in St. Paul's Episcopal Church, attending Sunday service, when a courier arrived with a telegram from General Lee. The message was brief and catastrophic. The defenses at Petersburg had collapsed. Richmond could not be held. The government must evacuate immediately. Davis left the church without explanation, his face betraying nothing. But within the hour, the Confederate capital descended into controlled chaos. Cabinet members burned documents in their offices. Military officers emptied arsenals, preparing to destroy what couldn't be carried. And in the basement of the Confederate Treasury Building on Main Street, clerks worked frantically to load the nation's remaining wealth onto wagons. The treasury itself was a mixture of currencies: Mexican silver dollars, gold eagles and double eagles, British sovereigns, and even some captured Union coins. There were also ingots, jewelry donated by patriotic Southern women, and bags of unrefined gold dust from Georgia and North Carolina mines. All of it was packed into wooden kegs and iron-banded chests, then covered with canvas to hide its nature from the crowds that were beginning to gather in the streets. By nightfall, Richmond was unraveling. Word of the evacuation had spread, and civilians understood what it meant. The war was lost, the government was fleeing, and anything of value left behind would be looted or burned. Mobs attacked liquor warehouses, and drunken soldiers joined the chaos. Fires, set deliberately to deny supplies to the advancing Union Army, spread out of control, consuming block after block of the city. Against this apocalyptic backdrop, the Treasury convoy assembled at the Richmond and Danville Railroad Depot. Captain William Parker, a career naval officer who had spent the war training midshipmen at the Confederate Naval Academy in Richmond, was given command of the treasure escort. His force consisted of about 60 young cadets, some barely 16 years old, along with a small detachment of experienced guards. Also accompanying the train were members of Davis's cabinet, their families, and various Confederate officials fleeing the capital. The train itself was a ragged collection of passenger cars, boxcars, and flatbeds, whatever rolling stock could be assembled on short notice. The treasury was loaded into a specially designated car, guarded at all times. Just after midnight, as Richmond burned behind them, the train lurched south into the darkness. No one on board knew where they were ultimately headed. Davis spoke vaguely of relocating the government to Danville, Virginia, then perhaps continuing to North Carolina or even Texas. What mattered was movement, staying ahead of Union forces long enough to, somehow, keep the Confederacy alive. The journey south was a nightmare of delays and uncertainty. The Richmond and Danville Railroad had been heavily damaged by Union raids, and the train frequently stopped for repairs to torn-up tracks. At one point, the convoy had to unload the treasury and transfer it to wagons to bypass a destroyed bridge, then reload it onto another train on the far side. Confederate authority was evaporating in real time. Local officials who days earlier had enforced martial law now abandoned their posts, and bands of deserters roamed the countryside looking for anything to steal. Parker and his midshipmen stood guard in shifts, rifles loaded, knowing that the greatest threat might not come from Union soldiers, but from their own desperate countrymen. The train reached Danville on April 3rd,
and Davis briefly set up headquarters there, still issuing orders, still insisting the war would continue.
But news arrived constantly, each report worse than the last. Lee's army was surrounded. Confederate forces in North Carolina were falling back. The Western Front was collapsing. On April 9th, word reached Danville that Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. Davis refused to accept it. He ordered the treasury moved again, this time toward Greensboro, North Carolina, where he hoped to join forces with General Joseph Johnston's army. But Johnston, a realist, knew the war was over. When Davis finally met with him on April 12th in Greensboro, Johnston urged immediate surrender. Davis would not hear it. For the next 3 weeks, the Confederate government in exile drifted south through the Carolinas and into Georgia, shrinking daily as officials deserted. The treasury, however, remained intact, still guarded by Parker's midshipmen. On April 26th, the convoy reached Johnston's headquarters near Durham, North Carolina, just as Johnston was finalizing surrender terms with Union General William Sherman. Davis, realizing North Carolina was lost, decided to continue toward Georgia and then Alabama, still clinging to the fantasy that the war could somehow continue. But his escort was now down to a few thousand cavalrymen, and even they were melting away. By early May, when the treasury reached Washington, Georgia, Davis was accompanied by only a few dozen men. It was here, in this small town near the South Carolina border, that the fateful decision was made. The treasury could not be moved further. The wagons were breaking down, the guards exhausted, and Union cavalry was closing in. On May 4, 1865, in a warehouse in Washington, Georgia, the Confederate treasury was divided for the last time. Approximately $108,000 in silver was distributed to Confederate soldiers as back pay, a symbolic gesture, final wages for men who would never serve again. But the gold, the real fortune, was handled separately. Captain Micaiah Clark, the acting Confederate treasurer, later testified that approximately $450,000 in gold and silver remained after the soldier payments. According to his account, this was placed in the custody of various Confederate officers who were instructed to transport it to safe locations for future use. Some was allegedly given to former Secretary of War John C. Breckinridge, who was fleeing toward Florida with plans to escape abroad. Another portion went to Captain Watson Van Bentuensen, who was to carry it toward Texas. Smaller amounts were entrusted to other officers whose names appeared in fragmentary records. But here, the official story falls apart. Within days, Jefferson Davis was captured near Irwinville, Georgia on May 10th. He had virtually no money with him, some personal funds, nothing more. Breckinridge eventually made it to Cuba, then to Europe, but there's no evidence he carried significant treasure. Van Bentuensen disappeared entirely from historical records after leaving Washington, Georgia. Union forces, desperate to recover the missing millions, interrogated captured Confederate officials extensively. Secretary of the Navy Stephen Mallory was imprisoned and questioned for months. Davis himself faced accusations that he had stolen the gold for personal use, charges he angrily denied until his death. Despite exhaustive searches, the Union recovered only a tiny fraction of the missing treasury. A farmer in Georgia found some coins buried in his field. A few $1,000s turned up in abandoned wagons, but the vast bulk, estimates ranged from $300,000 to over $1 million depending on the source, was simply gone, dissolved into the chaos of the Confederacy's final days, leaving only questions that would haunt historians for generations. New York City, in 1888 was the beating heart of American capitalism, a place where fortunes were made and destroyed between the opening and closing bells of the stock exchange. The city's financial district, clustered around Wall Street and Lower Broadway, hummed with a feverish energy that would have been unrecognizable to the merchants of just a generation earlier. This was the Gilded Age, the era Mark Twain named for its bright surface covering corruption beneath, when men like J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, and Cornelius Vanderbilt commanded wealth that rivaled the treasuries of European nations. It was an age of robber barons, of monopolies and trusts, of spectacular fortunes built on railways, steel, oil, and banking. And it was an age where few asked too many questions about where money came from, so long as it flowed freely into the right investment opportunities. Into this world stepped men like Mortimer Ashford, whose name appeared in the social registers of Manhattan's elite, but whose origins remained conveniently vague. Ashford was known as a banker and investor, a man with interests in Southern railways and cotton speculation. His brownstone on Madison Avenue was filled with European art. His wife was a patron of the Metropolitan Opera, and his daughter had married into an old Knickerbocker family. By all appearances, Mortimer Ashford was simply another successful member of New York's financial aristocratic. But on the evening of March 15, 1888, during a private dinner at Delmonico's restaurant on Fifth Avenue, Ashford collapsed between courses. Doctors were summoned immediately, but there was little they could do. Ashford died within the hour. His family gathered around him, murmuring about the strain of business and the toll of age. He was 63 years old. The funeral was well attended, the obituaries respectful, and within weeks the matter of settling his considerable estate began. It was during this process that Ashford's executors, sorting through papers in his private study, discovered the letter. It was sealed with wax, marked "To be opened upon my death," and addressed to no one in particular. When they broke the seal and read the contents, they immediately understood why Ashford had wanted this document to remain hidden until he was safely in the grave. The letter, written in Ashford's distinctive hand and dated just weeks before his death, was a confession. In carefully chosen words, Ashford admitted that his fortune, the wealth that had sustained his family for 2 decades, had not originated from legitimate business ventures. It came from Confederate gold, moved north in the months following the war's end, laundered through a network of sympathetic investors, and used to fund various enterprises that appeared entirely legitimate on paper. The letter named names. It described meetings in 1865 and 1866 held in hotel rooms in Atlanta, Richmond, and Baltimore, where former Confederate officers and Northern investors negotiated the dispossession of treasure that officially did not exist. Ashford claimed he had been recruited into this conspiracy by his uncle, a Confederate quartermaster who had survived the war and understood that the gold, if handled properly, could be transformed from rebel plunder into respectable American capital. The process, as Ashford described it, was methodical. Small amounts of gold were sold discreetly to jewelers and bullion dealers in various cities, never enough in one place to attract attention. The proceeds were invested in legitimate businesses, cotton brokerages, railway construction companies, banks that financed Southern Reconstruction. Over time, the Confederate origins of the capital became impossible to trace, buried under layers of transactions and partnerships. Some of the original conspirators died, their roles taken over by sons or business partners. Others simply faded into legitimate wealth, their past associations forgotten. But Ashford, perhaps driven by guilt or a desire for posthumous honesty, had documented it all. He listed dates, locations, amounts, and, most dangerously, the names of families who had benefited from the scheme. Many of these names, in 1888, still represented significant power in New York's financial world. The executors faced an immediate dilemma. If they made the letter public, they would destroy several prominent families, trigger criminal investigations, and likely plunge Ashford's own relatives into scandal and ruin. His daughter's marriage would be destroyed, his wife's social position annihilated. But if they suppressed the letter, they were complicit in concealing evidence of what might constitute theft on a massive scale. They chose a middle path. They shared the letter with several named in it, along with a discreet suggestion that perhaps arrangements could be made to ensure the document never reached the authorities or the press. This decision, intended to contain the scandal, instead set off a chain of events that would turn deadly. Within 2 months of Ashford's death, Lawrence Wickham, the attorney who first read the letter, drowned in the Hudson River. His body was found floating near the Chelsea piers, water in his lungs, pockets weighted with stones. The police ruled it suicide, noting that Wickham had been depressed about financial troubles. 6 weeks later, Harold Kemp, a clerk at Ashford's bank who had helped the executors inventory the estate, fell from a 4th-story window of his boarding house. Witnesses claimed he had been drinking heavily that evening. The coroner called it an accidental death. Then, in August of 1888, a man named Samuel Forrest was found dead in his Brooklyn apartment. Forrest had lived quietly for 20 years, working occasionally as a shipping clerk, attracting no attention. But Forrest had a past. He had served as a courier for the Confederate Treasury Department during the final weeks of the war. His name appeared in Ashford's letter, identified as one of the men who had helped transport gold north in 1865. When police investigated his death, they found his rooms had been ransacked, papers strewn everywhere, floorboards pried up as if someone had been searching for something hidden. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the detective who examined the scene, a man named Thomas Byrnes, noticed details that troubled him. Forrest's knuckles were bruised, suggesting he'd fought with someone. There were marks on his throat consistent with strangulation. And, most tellingly, every document related to Forrest's Confederate service, discharge papers, letters, photographs, had been taken. Only personal items of no historical value remained. Byrnes, already one of New York's most celebrated detectives, had built his reputation on seeing patterns others missed. He had pioneered the Rogues Gallery, a photographic database of known criminals, and developed interrogation techniques that made him feared in the city's underworld. Now, standing in Samuel Forrest's ransacked apartment, Byrnes sensed he was looking at something far more complex than a simple robbery. 3 deaths in 4 months, all connected, however loosely, to one dead banker. He began asking questions. Thomas Byrnes was not a man easily intimidated, which was precisely what he uncovered in the autumn of 1888 disturbed him so deeply. Byrnes had joined the New York Police Department after the Civil War. He had served in the Union Army, seen combat, and understood violence. As a detective, he had broken robbery rings, caught murderers, and faced down some of the most dangerous criminals in America's largest city. But the investigation into the deaths surrounding Mortimer Ashford's estate led him into a different kind of danger, one that wore expensive suits and operated from mahogany-paneled offices. Byrnes obtained a copy of Ashford's letter through channels he never publicly disclosed, most likely from one of the executors who was troubled by the subsequent deaths and wanted someone outside the social circle to examine the matter. What Byrnes read stunned him. The letter wasn't just a confession, it was a roadmap. Ashford had documented not only the origins of his fortune, but also the network that had made the laundering of Confederate gold possible. He named bankers, railway executives, former military officers, and even several New York politicians who had, knowingly or unknowingly, facilitated the transformation of rebel treasure into American wealth. More intriguingly, Ashford had included geographical details, descriptions of locations in Georgia where portions of the treasury had been temporarily hidden before being moved north, landmarks and coordinates based on surveyor's notes. Byrnes began by verifying what he could from public records. He discovered that several of the men named in Ashford's letter had indeed prospered remarkably in the years following the war, despite having no obvious source of capital. A former Confederate colonel was now a railway director. A one-time rebel quartermaster owned a profitable cotton brokerage in Atlanta. These men had moved north or remained in the South, but cultivated strong business ties with northern investors, particularly in New York. The pattern was clear to Byrnes. Confederate gold had been systematically moved into legitimate commerce through a network of conspirators who understood that the chaos of Reconstruction provided perfect cover. No one was tracking capital flows carefully in 1865 and 1866. The South was desperate for investment, the North eager to profit from rebuilding, and amidst this frenzy, money that should have raised questions was instead welcomed. What troubled Byrnes most was the implication that this conspiracy might still be active. Ashford's letter suggested that some of the original participants were still alive in 1888, and that their children had inherited not just wealth, but also the secret of its origins. These were not criminal gangs operating in the shadows. These were some of New York's most respected families. They sat on corporate boards, donated to churches, attended the opera. And based on the deaths following Ashford's confession, they were willing to kill to protect their secret. Byrnes's investigation hit obstacles almost immediately. When he attempted to interview one of the men named in Ashford's letter, a banker named Cornelius Hayward, he found that Hayward had departed suddenly for Europe and was not expected to return for several months. When Byrnes requested financial records from Ashford's bank, he was informed that such documents were confidential and could not be released without a court order. When he sought that court order, he discovered that the judge assigned to the case was a close friend of one of the families implicated. The message was clear. Powerful people wanted this investigation stopped. But Byrnes was stubborn, and he had resources. He assigned several trusted detectives to quietly investigate the backgrounds of men named in the letter, tracing their movements in the years immediately after the Civil War.
What emerged was fascinating.
In late 1865 and early 1866, several of these men had made trips to Georgia, ostensibly on business. Hotel records, railway tickets, and correspondence showed a pattern of travel to small towns in northern Georgia, Washington, Augusta, Athens, always for brief stays, always around the same period. Byrnes began to suspect that the original hiding places for the Confederate gold had been in Georgia, and that the treasure had been gradually moved north over the course of several months in small shipments that wouldn't attract attention. One name kept appearing in Byrnes's investigation: Captain Watson Van Benthuisen, the Confederate officer who had reportedly been entrusted with a portion of the treasury in May 1865 and then vanished from history. Official records showed Van Benthuisen had been paroled by Union authorities in June 1865. But after that, nothing. No census records, no death certificate, no trace. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. But Byrnes found something interesting: a property deed in Savannah, Georgia, dated 1867, transferring ownership of a warehouse from a W. Van Benthuisen to a New York shipping company. The shipping company was owned by one of the men named in Ashford's letter. Byrnes believed he had found the trail. Van Benthuisen had survived, moved the gold he was entrusted with to Savannah, and used it as capital to establish business connections with northern investors. He had likely changed his identity afterward, disappeared into civilian life under a different name, and died in obscurity while the men he'd enriched prospered. It was a perfect crime, one that had gone undetected for over 2 decades because the victims, the Union government, and the American taxpayers didn't even know they'd been robbed. In December of 1888, Byrnes traveled to Georgia himself, following the clues in Ashford's letter. He visited Washington, the town where the treasury had been divided, and spoke with elderly residents who remembered the chaos of May 1865. One old man, a former Confederate soldier, told Byrnes about wagons that had left town in the middle of the night, heavily guarded, heading not west toward Alabama as official accounts claimed, but east toward Augusta. Another resident recalled hearing stories about gold being buried along the Savannah River, hidden until it could be safely retrieved. Byrnes searched property records and found several parcels of land that had changed hands suspiciously in 1865 and 1866, sold by anonymous owners to out-of-state buyers. He visited these locations, now mostly farmland or forest, and while he found no treasure, any gold had long since been recovered by those who hid it, he found confirmation. This was where it had happened. This was where Confederate gold had been hidden, then gradually smuggled north, transformed from rebel currency into the foundation of Gilded Age fortunes. Byrnes returned to New York in January of 1889 with evidence, testimony, documents, and a clear picture of what had occurred. But he also returned with a profound understanding that he would never be allowed to pursue this case to its conclusion.
The institutional forces arrayed against Thomas Byrnes became clear within days of his return from Georgia. His superior officers, normally supportive of his investigations, suddenly expressed concern that he was wasting department resources on a case with no clear crime. After all, they argued, even if Confederate gold had been moved north and invested in legitimate businesses, what law had been broken? The Confederacy had ceased to exist. Its treasury was technically contraband of war, and the federal government's failure to recover it in 1865 was hardly a matter for the New York Police Department in 1889. When Byrnes pointed out that 3 men had died under suspicious circumstances, he was told that those deaths had already been investigated and resolved. Suicide, accident, heart failure. There was no evidence of murder. Byrnes understood what was happening. Pressure was being applied from above, from people with influence over the police department's budget and the political careers of its leadership. He was being warned off. But Byrnes had one advantage. He was famous. His reputation as New York's greatest detective gave him a degree of independence, and he still had allies in the press. He leaked portions of the story to a friendly journalist at the New York Herald, carefully omitting specific names, but providing enough detail to make the conspiracy public. The resulting article, published in February 1889, created a sensation. The lost Confederate millions. Did rebel gold fund Gilded Age fortunes? The headline screamed. The piece detailed the disappearance of the Confederate treasury, the suspicious prosperity of certain former rebel officers, and the mysterious deaths following Mortimer Ashford's confession. The story was carefully worded to avoid libel. No one was directly accused, but anyone with connections to New York's financial elite could read between the lines. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Several families threatened lawsuits against the Herald. Editorials in other newspapers, many of which were controlled by the same financial interests implicated in the conspiracy, denounced the article as irresponsible speculation and slanderous rumor. But the public was fascinated. The Gilded Age had already produced widespread resentment toward the wealthy elite, whose monopolies and labor practices had created vast inequality. The idea that some of these fortunes might have been built on stolen Confederate gold added a delicious irony. Northern robber barons profiting from Southern treasure, the spoils of a lost rebellion laundered into American respectability. For a few weeks, the story dominated conversation in the city's saloons, barbershops, and tenements. Then the counterattack began. A series of articles appeared in prominent newspapers questioning Thomas Byrnes' motives and competence. Unnamed sources suggested he was pursuing the case for personal publicity, that he had been reprimanded by superiors for overstepping his authority, that his evidence was circumstantial at best. More seriously, documents suddenly surfaced suggesting financial impropriety on Byrnes's part, a bribe allegedly received years earlier, an investment in a questionable business. Byrnes immediately recognized these accusations as fabricated, designed to discredit him. But mud thrown at a public figure tends to stick regardless of truth. His position became increasingly untenable. In March of 1889, Byrnes was quietly reassigned, away from major investigations, to administrative duties, a clear demotion disguised as a lateral move.
He was told it was temporary, pending resolution of the allegations against him, but he knew better. He had gotten too close to something powerful people wanted kept buried, and he was being neutralized. Byrnes considered resignation, considered going public with everything he knew, but he was also a pragmatist. Without his position in the police department, he would have no resources, no authority,
and likely no protection. The men behind this conspiracy had already killed to protect their secret. Byrnes had no illusions about what might happen to him if he became too dangerous. The final blow came in May of 1889, when Ashford's letter itself disappeared. The executors of his estate claimed it had been stolen from their offices, though no break-in was reported and nothing else was taken. Without the letter, Byrnes had no documentary evidence of the conspiracy. Everything else was circumstantial: suspicious deaths that could be explained away, financial patterns that proved nothing definitive, testimony from elderly Georgians about events a quarter-century old. The case, for all practical purposes, was dead. Byrnes continued in the police department for several more years, even regaining some of his former authority after the allegations against him quietly faded. But he never reopened the investigation into the Confederate gold. He retired in 1895, a wealthy man himself by then. His fame had led to lucrative private security consulting, and lived until 1910. In interviews late in his life, Byrnes occasionally alluded to the case that got away, the conspiracy he couldn't break. He never named names publicly, but he made it clear he believed the stolen Confederate treasury had indeed made its way north, that it had funded legitimate businesses, and that some of America's most prominent families owed their fortunes to gold that should have been returned to the federal government in 1865. The question remained: what had actually happened to the gold? Based on Byrnes's investigation and subsequent historical research, a plausible reconstruction emerged. In the chaotic days of May 1865, when the Confederate treasury was divided in Washington, Georgia, several officers entrusted with portions of the gold did not attempt to deliver it to Jefferson Davis or any remaining Confederate authority. They understood the war was over and that the Confederacy would never be resurrected. Instead, they hid the gold in various locations across Georgia, planning to retrieve it once Union occupation forces withdrew and attention moved elsewhere. Over the following months and years, they gradually recovered the hidden treasure, selling it in small quantities to avoid detection. Some of this gold went to fund struggling Confederate veterans, but much of it was invested, often in partnership with Northern businessmen who asked few questions about the capital's origins. The timing was perfect. The South needed investment desperately, and money that might have raised eyebrows in 1866 was completely invisible by 1870, absorbed into the general flow of Reconstruction capital. By the time the Gilded Age was in full swing, the Confederate origins of certain fortunes were known only to a handful of people, and those people had every incentive to keep silent. Their children inherited wealth without inheriting the full truth, and their grandchildren might know nothing at all of the treasure that had started the family fortune. The Confederate gold hadn't vanished, it had transformed, becoming railroads and banks and factories, woven into the fabric of American capitalism so thoroughly that its origins became impossible to trace.
While Thomas Byrnes's investigation stalled in New York, another thread of the story was unfolding in the records and memories of the South itself. The men who had been directly involved in moving the Confederate gold, the officers, couriers, and officials who had made the decisions in those final chaotic days, mostly took their secrets to the grave. But some left traces. Captain Micaiah Clark, the Confederate acting treasurer, published a detailed account of the Treasury's final days in 1893, likely motivated by ongoing accusations that Jefferson Davis had stolen the gold. Clark's account was careful and self-serving, but it provided important details about how much gold existed, where it went, and who was responsible. According to Clark, after paying Confederate troops their final wages in Washington, Georgia, approximately $450,000 in gold and silver remained. He claimed he personally witnessed this sum being divided among several officers, including John C. Breckinridge, William Parker, and others. Clark insisted that every dollar was accounted for and that no theft occurred. The treasure was simply dispersed for safekeeping with the intention of preserving it for a future Confederate government that never materialized. Once it became clear the Confederacy was permanently dissolved, Clark argued the officers who held the gold were in an impossible position. Technically, it should have been surrendered to Union authorities, but many felt the gold belonged to the Southern people who had contributed it, not to the conquering North. This rationalization that the gold was Southern property, not federal government property, became the justification for what happened next. Rather than surrender the treasure, the men who held it treated it as private assets to be distributed among Confederate veterans or used to rebuild the South. In practice, of course, very little went to struggling veterans. Most was invested in business ventures that primarily benefited the officers themselves and their Northern partners. One particularly well-documented case involved a former Confederate officer named Charles Thorburn, who appeared in Atlanta in 1867 with sufficient capital to establish a cotton brokerage that quickly became one of the city's largest. Thorburn was known to have been part of the Treasury escort in 1865, and he made no secret that his business was funded by assets preserved during the war's final days. He cultivated relationships with Northern cotton merchants and within a decade was a wealthy man. When he died in 1889, the same year Byrnes's investigation collapsed, his obituary mentioned his shrewd business sense, but said nothing about where his initial capital came from. His children inherited the business and expanded it into a textile empire that lasted well into the 20th century. Similar patterns appeared throughout the South. In Richmond, a former Confederate Navy officer opened a shipping company in 1868 with unexplained capital. In Charleston, a rebel quartermaster established a rice export business that thrived despite his having been virtually penniless at war's end. In New Orleans, a consortium of former Confederate officials invested in railway construction, becoming major players in the rebuilding of Southern infrastructure. These success stories were celebrated during Reconstruction as proof that Southern enterprise could rise from the ashes of defeat. But darker questions lurked beneath the surface. Where had the capital come from? The men involved offered vague explanations: family wealth, pre-war investments, loans from sympathetic Northern financiers. In the chaos of Reconstruction, few investigators were positioned to dig deeper. The federal government was focused on political reconstruction, not financial forensics. And many Northerners, including government officials, were happy to see the South rebuild if it meant new opportunities for Northern investment and trade. The possibility that some of this capital came from the missing Confederate treasury was suspected, but never definitively proven. The safest place for secrets, however, was in the private vaults of New York banks, where the ultimate destinations of much Confederate gold ended up locked away. In researching the financial history of the Gilded Age, historians later found intriguing patterns.
Several banks that became major players in the 1870s and 1880s had been minor institutions before the war, but suddenly showed significant capital increases in the late 1860s. The sources of these capital injections were often listed as private investors or Southern commercial interests. One bank in particular, the Commercial and Merchants Bank of New York, showed a remarkable transformation. In 1865, it was a small savings institution serving middle-class depositors. By 1870, it had tripled in size and was financing major railway projects. The bank's president, a man named Augustus Penfield, had served as a Union quartermaster during the war and had extensive connections in the occupied South during Reconstruction. Penfield's personal fortune grew enormously during this period, and upon his death in 1892, his estate was valued at over $3 million, a staggering sum for the era. How had a military supply officer become one of New York's wealthiest men in just 25 years? The official explanation was that Penfield had made shrewd investments in post-war Southern recovery. But Thomas Byrnes, in his private notes, suspected Penfield had been one of the Northern partners who helped launder Confederate gold, taking a percentage in exchange for providing the financial infrastructure to transform bullion into legitimate assets. Perhaps the most tantalizing piece of evidence regarding the gold's final destination came not from official records, but from a diary discovered decades later. In 1947, the descendants of a Confederate officer named Samuel Wragg found a leather-bound journal among his effects. Wragg had served in the Confederate Treasury Department and had been part of the escort that accompanied the gold south from Richmond. His diary, written in cryptic shorthand that took researchers months to decode, described events in May and June of 1865. Wragg confirmed that portions of the treasury were indeed hidden in Georgia, buried in locations marked by surveyors' notes. He described meetings with Northern investors in Savannah and Augusta, negotiations over how the gold could be moved north without detection. And most significantly, he named names, specific individuals, some of them prominent in Gilded Age business, who he claimed were partners in the conspiracy. The diary also contained something else: coordinates. Wragg had marked several locations, describing them as recovery sites where gold had been temporarily buried before being moved. By the time the diary was discovered in 1947, these locations had long since been built over: residential neighborhoods, commercial districts, highways. If gold remained in any of them, it was now under tons of concrete and asphalt. But the diary confirmed what Byrnes had suspected 70 years earlier. The Confederate gold had been systematically looted, moved north, and used to build fortunes that shaped American business for generations. The story of the vanished Confederate gold didn't end in 1889 with the collapse of Thomas Byrnes's investigation, nor did it end in 1947 with the discovery of Samuel Wragg's diary. It continued, in various forms, throughout the 20th century and into our own time. Treasure hunters, inspired by legends of buried Confederate wealth, have searched across Georgia, Alabama, and other southern states for over a century and a half. Some claimed to have found small caches, a few coins here, some silver bars there, but nothing approaching the massive fortune that supposedly disappeared. Most likely, there is no treasure left to find. The gold was recovered by those who hid it, converted into currency and investments, and absorbed into the American economy long ago. But the story itself became a kind of treasure, a narrative that illuminated uncomfortable truths about how wealth and power actually function. The Gilded Age fortunes that shaped modern America were built on many sources: innovation, exploitation, theft, genius, cruelty, and luck. That some portion of this wealth originated in the looted treasury of a failed rebellion adds one more layer to an already complex story. It reminds us that the boundaries between legitimate and illegitimate wealth, between respectable business and outright theft, are often blurrier than we'd like to admit. The families that allegedly benefited from Confederate gold, if Ashford's letter and Byrnes's investigation were accurate, continued to prosper through the 20th century. Some of these names remain prominent today, attached to charitable foundations, business empires, and political dynasties. None of them have publicly acknowledged any connection to the missing treasury, and given the passage of time, it's possible current generations genuinely don't know. Family legends tend to sanitize origins, transforming robber barons into self-made entrepreneurs and laundered treasure into shrewd investments. This process of myth-making is not unique to these particular families. It's how virtually all dynastic wealth presents itself. What makes the Confederate gold story compelling is how it crystallizes this process, showing us the exact moment when stolen assets became respectable fortunes. We can trace the transformation, see the mechanisms that made it possible, and understand why powerful people were willing to kill to prevent the truth from emerging. It's a case study in how history gets written and rewritten, how inconvenient facts get buried alongside the treasure they describe. The murders that followed Mortimer Ashford's death, if they were indeed murders and not the coincidences the authorities claimed, were never officially solved. Lawrence Wickham's drowning, Harold Kemp's fall, Samuel Forrest's suspicious death, all remain closed cases, mysteries from a distant era when forensic science was primitive and powerful people could manipulate investigations far more easily than today. But these deaths served their purpose. They sent a clear message to anyone else who might have known about the Confederate gold conspiracy. Silence was the price of survival. This might explain why so few participants in the scheme left records, why the paper trail is so fragmentary, why the story survived primarily through rumors and hints rather than documentation. Fear is an effective archival tool, ensuring that secrets remain buried as thoroughly as any treasure hidden in Georgia mud. The few records that do exist, Ragg's diary, Ashford's vanished letter, Byrnes' notes, Clark's published account, emerged either posthumously or when their authors felt safe enough to speak. Even then, they spoke carefully, in ways that implicated the dead more than the living, that suggested rather than proved. Modern historians who have studied the missing Confederate treasury generally agree on a few points. First, the gold certainly existed. Confederate records, though fragmentary, clearly document the evacuation of the treasury from Richmond. Second, the vast majority was never recovered by Union authorities, despite extensive searches and interrogations. Third, several former Confederate officers and officials who had contact with the Treasury exhibited unexplained wealth in the years following the war. But proving a direct connection between the missing gold and specific Gilded Age fortunes remains difficult. Too much time has passed, too many records have been destroyed or never existed, and too many people with knowledge took their secrets to the grave. The story exists in a frustrating historical twilight, too well documented to dismiss as legend, too poorly documented to prove conclusively. This ambiguity is itself revealing. If the gold had simply been lost or scattered among desperate soldiers, we would expect more clarity, more accounts of small finds, more deathbed confessions from veterans. Instead, we have a conspicuous silence, a hole in the historical record that suggests deliberate concealment rather than mere loss. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Confederate gold story is what it reveals about the American myth of self-made success. The Gilded Age celebrated the self-made man, the entrepreneur who rose from nothing through hard work and genius. Figures like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller were held up as exemplars of this ideal, proof that American capitalism rewarded merit and ambition. But scratch beneath the surface of most Gilded Age fortunes, and you find less inspiring origins: monopolistic practices, political corruption, labor exploitation, and, in some cases, outright theft. The Confederate gold conspirators, if they existed as Byrnes believed, were simply more direct than most. They took wealth that wasn't theirs, moved it through a network of complicit allies, and transformed it into legitimate businesses. They then used their wealth to gain political influence, social respectability, and the power to suppress any investigation into their origins. In this, they were not aberrations, but rather perfect representatives of their age. The Gilded Age was built on similar transformations, where the brutal origins of fortunes were gilded over with philanthropy, culture, and carefully constructed myths. The Confederate gold was just one stream feeding into this larger river of wealth, indistinguishable from the rest once it had been properly laundered. The Confederate treasury vanished into the chaos of 1865, transformed into Gilded Age fortunes, and buried under layers of legitimate business so deep that its origins became invisible. Men died to protect that secret. Investigations were crushed, and the truth was carefully managed into obscurity. We may never know with absolute certainty which families built their wealth on that stolen gold, but we do know this: the story reveals something fundamental about how power and money actually work in America. History isn't just written by the victors, it's written by those who can afford to control the narrative. If this investigation into one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries fascinated you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the hidden stories that shaped our world. Leave a like if you enjoyed this documentary, and tell us in the comments, what other historical mysteries do you want us to investigate? From vanished treasures to forgotten conspiracies, your suggestions help guide our research. And if you really want to support this channel and get access to extended content, behind-the-scenes research notes, and early access to new documentaries, check out our Patreon linked below. Until next time, keep questioning the official story, because the truth is always more complex than the myths we inherit.